This is the Good Government Podcast with Aaron Slutkin and Michael Hoffpauir.
I was talking with my advisees today about the upcoming break and asked where they would like to go if they could, and half of them just wanted barbecue. And we have fine barbecue in Maryland, no regional specialty, just a couple of good places. But Austin came up a couple times.
They want Austin barbecue, not Memphis barbecue, not North Carolina barbecue or South Carolina barbecue. Oh, that's interesting. Memphis barbecue should be mentioned. I'm sure probably Oklahoma has something to say. But yeah, but Terry Black's is here and it's world famous. And there's other places that could go, oh, there's like better than Terry Black's. I was like, that's fine. I'll let you all have those fights. It's all brisket.
Yeah, brisket and beef ribs. Maybe this is a authoritative argument for Texas barbecue. The only place I've ever seen a beef rib is in Austin. In 2024, I tried for the first time barbecue in Memphis, barbecue in Texas, Austin specifically. Austin wins.
You know, I don't mind that mustard sauce.
No.
At first, I didn't think I would. But, I'm not trying to pick a winner over something else. I like how it's like I want to get real apologetic when it comes to talking about barbecue. I don't want to be too authoritative and state an actual opinion.
This is probably extremely dangerous. People say that American cultures are coalescing and mass culture and television is making us all too similar. But food seems to be actively resisting this. You have Brooklyn barbecue, and it costs $25 for one slice of brisket and one ring of pickled onions. I don't know if you've seen this on Twitter before. But people really get serious about their food.
Yeah. It's the new religion. So let's turn to Federalist Paper 16. This is the same subject continued, one of my favorite subjects in the Federalist Papers. It's the same subject continued in relation to the same principles. We're concerned with imperio in imperium, an empire within empire, a sovereignty within a sovereignty, and how it is that you might have a national government that's capable of governing human beings who exist in states and not living in a state of war. National government must be able to operate on individuals, and it must not be beholden to the states to access the individuals within those states. So the principle of legislation for states or communities in their political capacities is an exceptionable principle. Publius says, it may as truly as emphatically be styled the parent of anarchy. It has been seen that delinquencies in the members of the Union are its natural and necessary offspring, and that whenever they happen, the only constitutional remedy is force, and the immediate effect of the use of it, civil war. This principle is terrible. We cannot have imperio and imperium because we cannot have civil war. We cannot have civil war because the whole point of this government is to tame the passions of men, offer them security. I remind you of that wonderful passage from Federalist 15, paragraph 13. Why has government been instituted at all? Because the passions of men will not conform to the dictates of reason and justice without constraint. So whenever you've taken recourse to civil war, you're admitting that the restraints you mean to impose upon men are not finding any purchase. Well, this is no good. But Publius has to continue to make the case. I really like what happens in the following paragraph of Federalist 16 here.
In paragraph number 3, he describes what he calls in paragraph 4 the violent death of a confederacy. So we can imagine a situation like this. Publius is telling us it's currently happening in America in the 1780s. A state refuses to comply with a requisition that is legally binding on it, but the national government does not have the teeth to make the states comply. Well, this national government cannot operate directly on the citizens. Therefore, it cannot raise taxes on them by taxing their whiskey. And so how then do you get a state to comply with a requisition? Well, there's no recourse to enforcement of the law, for example, through a civil magistrate or through a police officer or a bailiff. So instead, the only way a state can achieve compliance is by the sword. And so there's the state of war that we got in Federalist 15. And in paragraph number 3, Publius is showing us how many circumstances in which this is likely to arise. Are foreign powers come in again. A state may not actually be able to pay a requisition, or they may say that they're unable to pay a requisition. We're not going to know what explanations are spurious and we shouldn't take, and what are serious, a non-ability to pay. And as such, if the state only has the recourse to the sword, well, when everything you have, the state only has recourse to the sword, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. There's going to be constant warfare.
Look at the middle of paragraph 3 of Federalist 16. Specious arguments of danger to the general liberty could easily be contrived. So these are these sorts of statesmen whose rhetorical prowess allows them to contrive these specious arguments and move the people, who we should understand are a mob. At this point, if we're thinking back to the difference between individual behavior and group behavior as outlined in Fed 15. So we can take what we learned about individual behavior versus group behavior in Fed 15 and now understand in Fed 16 how much more volatile the situations are in various states, because each of the states can understand itself as a collective, less inhibited by the restraints that operate on individual human beings. They're ripe material for anyone who's a member of the family of the lion or the tribe of the eagle. Specious arguments of danger to the general liberty could easily be contrived, Publius says. Plausible excuses for the deficiencies of the party could, without difficulty, be invented to alarm the apprehensions, inflame the passions, and conciliate the goodwill, even of those states which were not chargeable with any violation or omission of duty. So now all of a sudden, one state's easily going to pull another state in. All of this is now running hotter. It's all passion, opposite the reason and justice of which Publius spoke back there in Federalist Paper number 15. The concerns Publius has throughout these first 16 Federalist Papers are pretty similar. And what I mean by that is they're pretty similar because the understanding of human beings and their possibilities or capacities, their nature, remains pretty consistent. Human beings can be just, they can be reasonable, they can also be unreasonable and unjust because they can be driven by their passions, their anxieties, their desires to gain, their ambitions, and so on and so forth. Notice he says, in ambitious premeditations in their rulers, with a view to getting rid of all external control upon their designs of personal aggrandizement. Consistently a problem. Power is jealous of that which overpowers it. And I mean jealous in the sense of envious. Power is envious of that which overpowers it. It's as if there's only a finite amount of power in these relations.
Look at the third to last sentence of the paragraph. When the sword is once drawn, the passions of men observe no bounds of moderation. That's civil war. And Publius says the country is experiencing the natural death of the Confederacy, right? The thing's just falling apart at the seams. But if it doesn't not die naturally, it's going to die violently. I think here of his discussion of standing armies in number 6 that we've talked about before. One of the great anti-federalist fears is this Constitution was going to bring about a standing army that was going to crush the states. But over and over again, we've seen Publius say, if you are afraid of a standing army, then you need to give this government more power. Because either wars between the states if the Confederacy falls apart, or a standing army necessary to enforce the law, to make the requisitions by the Confederation Congress binding, are going to bring about the kind of warfare that the standing army will necessitate. And you should be afraid, you states, of even a weak government that is acting extra-constitutionally. Once you create this constitution and give it powers, then at least it's bound. But if the Confederation Congress has to take up powers that it does not by law possess, but that by right it must possess, then you have it acting outside of the formulation. That's even more scary. And that, I think he thinks, is the result of the Imperio and Imperium.
You're totally right to remind us of 6. You can also see that in Federalist Paper number 8. Military despotism will result from this. And I like the way that you speak of this. I personally would speak of it as Publius's judo. his ability to use the argument of the anti-federalists against the anti-federalists. And it's all about human beings. It's all about human beings who have passions, who have fear. Because if you continue that paragraph to the very end, paragraph 3 of Federalist 16, the suggestions of wounded pride, the instigations of irritated resentment would be apt to carry the states against which the arms of the Union were exerted to any extremes necessary to avenge the affront or to avoid the disgrace of submission. The first war of this kind would probably terminate in the dissolution of the Union. Well, we'll worry about that last sentence whenever you're ready to worry about it. But I want to point out to you that what Publius is saying here is that wounded pride and resentment, the desire for vengeance, to avoid a disgrace, these things are going to tear us apart. I would remind you that Publius is not trying to cut these aspects of human beings out of them, but he is trying to channel them towards something like a concern with the Union as established under the proposed Constitution, because all of that concern about pride and dignity and being a human being who can justly work with other human beings and place demands upon them was the spring of Federalist Papers number 15. It's what he appealed to there, Publius, to show that the existing state of the Union under the Articles of Confederation was beneath our dignity and an insult to our pride. He's saying pride can be dangerous, and then he's also going to use pride to attach us to the Union and Constitution.
And it's helpful to remember that, because this lofty language about union that Publius teaches us and that he gives forward to statesmen like Webster and Lincoln really isn't here in 16. What is 16 about? 16 is about showing me the utility of the Union as a means to avoid dying a violent death or a sure death at the hands of a standing army or having my liberty taken away. He's operating on my desire for safety. He's operating maybe also on my love of liberty. But the costs right now are high. The point in paragraph number 7 is if we do want to avoid civil war, military coercion, then, as he repeats himself from paper number 15, the federal government must carry its agency persons of the citizens. It must stand in need of no intermediate legislations, but must itself be empowered to employ the arm of the ordinary magistrate to execute its own resolutions, an intermediary lawman between the national government and the state government. But that intermediary is the citizen of the several states who are going to be made in a meaningful way citizens of the national state.
Notice that this citizen, who you're now calling an intermediary, also has hopes and fears. And those hopes and fears, Publius says here in the 7th paragraph of Fed 16, are things which the national government may address. This is really interesting. Here, I'll read the sentence to show you where I am. The government of the Union, like that of each state, must be able to address itself immediately to the hopes and fears of individuals and to attract to its support those passions which have the strongest influence upon the human heart. It must, in short, possess all the means and have a right to resort to all the methods of executing the powers with which it is entrusted that are possessed and exercised by governments of the particular states. So imagine now, hopes and fears are to be met through the institutions established here by Publius in the U.S. Constitution. That is to say, the hopes and fears of individuals are to be institutionalized. And I don't mean put away in an institution. I mean made a part of the political structure. These passions that are strongest in us are to be directed. So we're not sitting back in a fear of a violent death, even though Publius has used that fear of violent death to help us see why we want the Constitution and Union and not the Articles of Confederation and its League of Friendship. Instead, that fear and those hopes should be channeled to the Constitution and Union, which is capable of securing our liberty. What would our hope be? It can secure our liberty. It can keep us safe. What should our fear be? That people don't obey the law. They don't follow the Constitution. That the national government offers dictates to individuals and they don't abide by them. That should be our fear. So act according to your fear. Guard against it. create now an institution which is much softer than the hard institution of the sword, of the standing military, by using the hopes and fears that are in all of us to make people good citizens. And again, this is why I want to underline, they're also good citizens. They're not good subjects. They're not good sheep or good cows. They're self-governing. So if anyone is wincing at what I'm saying right now, I understand, I think, why one would wince. But this stuff exists in us no matter what. And it's also going to be operative in us and a tool of the government. I'm sorry, Aaron, to interrupt. Part of self-government means that we have the appropriate or proper hopes and fears.
We read the Federalist, but we read it as citizens who are reflecting on it, knowing we also have the Constitution before us. I wonder if it's helpful to look at a specific example within the Constitution about how this is meant to work, perhaps by thinking about what is the Articles of Confederation's recourse to put down an insurrection, and what is the Constitution's recourse?
What form of government does the Articles of Confederation guarantee in every state? And what form of government does the United States Constitution guarantee in every state? Isn't that a place to put your hope? And that hope is not far from the fear. Let's think about it this way. Look at the characteristics that we've seen in the previous paragraphs in Federalist 16. Pride, resentment, the desire to avenge oneself for an affront. Now, what Publius is here operating on, though, are our hopes and fears of the individual. And he's trying to stave off or compartmentalize the pride and resentments that occupy those who desire self-aggrandizement and those who employ military forces against their brothers. We must come to terms with human nature. It's the material that we have. And you can't throw it away. You can't just eat soma and get rid of it. But you sure can channel it for a human being to govern himself and maybe even live a life that's flourishing in some way. So look at how Publius is both not Hobbes and not one of these visionaries who thinks that Republican virtue is all we need and we can get it in the States, like the anti-fence thing. What do you think of this objection in paragraph 8?
8 reads, "To this reasoning it may perhaps be objected that if any state should be disaffected to the authority of the Union, it could at any time obstruct the execution of its laws and bring the matter to the same issue of force, with the necessity of which the opposite scheme is reproach." So let's think of the word disaffection, right? Where is your affection going to lie as a citizen? And what happens when your state comes into conflict with the national government? He answers this in paragraphs number 9 and 10.
To state the objection clearly, anytime the states don't like what the national government is doing, couldn't they simply obstruct the execution of the national government's laws? And in that situation, how is it any different than what will occur in the Articles of Confederation, according to Publius? So if a state says, I'm not going to allow the integration of the races and have a school wherein everyone can attend, what are you going to do? Send in the National Guard to force it on people? This is the objection here that Publius raises, one that we can see play out in American history. For crying out loud, what's about to happen in the next paragraphs here reminds me of the nullification crisis of 1828. So Publius is thinking through these problems of federalism very seriously. We still have the same problem of the way that bodies of men will behave. Can Publius fix this problem?
There's a difference between a non-compliance and a direct and active resistance. That language comes from paragraph number 9. Look, in some of these cases, the national government is not going to need the participation or the compliance of the state to be actually able to enforce the law. That's the point of the new Constitution, one of the points. The execution of the laws touches on the very citizens. But what if the national government were indeed acting tyrannically? And here, Mike, I really take your point where the national government has a new orientation to the passions of the citizens. Look in this second to last sentence of paragraph number 10. If the people were not tainted with the spirit of their state representatives, these state representatives that are interposing themselves between the execution of the law and the people, they, as the natural guardians of the Constitution, would throw their weight into the national scale and give it a decided preponderancy in the contest. Attempts of this kind would not be often made with levity or rashness, because they could seldom be made without danger to the authors, unless in cases of tyrannical exercise of the federal authority. So putting those aside, in cases where the national government is doing something just or reasonable or necessary, and the states are getting in the way, the people, they are natural guardians of the Constitution, are going to side with the national government. Now, I wonder about this. In paper number 17, we see that the states are only going to lose the affection of the people if they administer the laws much better. That's one way in which that will happen. Why is it that the people are already in this scheme like natural guardians of the Constitution? I'm not sure I understand.
Can you say this again, Aaron?
In a situation in which the states are unjustly interposing themselves against a execution of the law, and the national government really isn't exercising a tyrannical authority, because he says we're not discussing a situation like this. The people, he says, as natural guardians of the Constitution, are going to throw their weight into the national scale and give it a decided preponderancy in the contest. I wonder, and this seems to be directly involved with the passions, because he's talking about the affections of the people, and affection or feelings or love is necessary for something to want to conserve it, I think, and to conserve it in opposition to the state governments, which are closer to you, and that he says we feel a more natural affection for because of our distance to them. I'm thinking here, by anticipating some of the arguments he makes in number 17. I guess I wonder, I'm not sure I'm convinced why it is that the people are natural guardians of the national Constitution.
If we play it really safe here and only work with the arguments we have thus far and don't look ahead to explain this away, the most I can see at this point is that the people will be occupants of a state that has ratified the Constitution. And so they will have made an agreement to live under this Constitution, which is to make laws that operate on them as individuals. So then all of a sudden, if you have a series of actors inside of the state government trying to usurp the decision that the people have already made by way of trying to interpose or nullify the actions of the federal government, the people themselves should be, wait a minute, we ratified the Constitution, and right now you're acting like we didn't do that. This is cheating now. The people are to understand the Constitution as themselves. I'm really cheating. I said I wouldn't do it, but I am. So if we've willed this thing into being, and then there's these people up in the state legislatures that are deciding to thwart our will, we should be enemies with them. Because as much as we would guard our own lives, our own property, we should be willing to guard the Constitution. It's not developed here. It's just said in a sentence, as you say, Aaron. But that's my thinking, trying not to cheat and then cheating. Is that satisfactory? I mean,
it's touching on this desire for safety that we've talked about today. It's also talking about pride. And so I think it helps me see the importance of that passion for Publius's political project.
Publius is playing with serious stuff here. Interposition and nullification are dangerous, and they stem from human passion and the desire for aggrandizement. Here, the problem is not whether the law is good or bad. Here, the problem is just the passion of men and their jealousy of power. The judges were not embarked in a conspiracy with the legislature. They would pronounce the resolutions of such a majority to be contrary to the supreme law of the land, unconstitutional and void. So he hopes there are other safeguards prior. Judicial review is therefore here, is what I want to point out.
Yeah.
Now it's state level judicial review. States that try to strike down a federal law should have the state courts say, no, state legislature, you can't strike down that law. And then the people should throw their weight into the matter and do so as guardians of the Constitution. The people, therefore, can aid the federal government against the state if need be. They can keep federalism operating. Why they would do so, it's tough. They have to see that their hopes and fears are better met. Their hopes are better met and their fears are better assuaged through the national Constitution, and understand that what the state legislatures are up to is no good. So why don't we think of it this way? The people are the natural guardians of the Constitution. Let's not get too hung up on that language and think about it in terms of why would the people care that the state legislatures are doing this, thwarting, disobeying the national government's laws. We're back in the position of all of the previous pages we've read, where states are deciding what to do according to which way the wind is blowing. What is this? Anarchy. So the reason why the people would care about the matter and be natural guardians of the Constitution is because they're products of Publius's education. They understand now the danger of state interposition, let alone state nullification of federal laws.
What do you make of the ending of paper number 16? Does Publius go so far as to say that no government can last in perpetuity? He talks about how conflicts, we might think of them as constitutional crises or rebellions or insurrections. They're going to spring up. They're going to happen. No government, no regime can possibly preclude all avenues for this because of these passions, Mike, we've been talking about. And as to those mortal feuds, he says about midway through the 11th paragraph, by mortal, I think he means fatal, which in certain conjectures spread a conflagration through a whole nation, or through a very large proportion of it proceeding either from weighty causes of discontent given by the government, or from the contagion of some violent popular paroxysm. They do not fall within any ordinary rules of calculation. When they happen, they commonly amount to revolutions and dismemberments of empire. No form of government can always either avoid or control them. It is in vain to hope to guard against events too mighty for human foresight or precaution. And it would be idle to object to a government because it could not perform impossibilities. Now I can take that principle that we shouldn't not make a government because it might fade away one day. The Articles of Confederation are meant to be perpetual. But I wonder if he thinks that it's impossible for human artifice to create a regime which can truly last forever.
Yeah, and remember back in Federalist Paper 15, all governments want to last forever. Mm-hmm. It's the same way that an artificial man, perhaps like Hobbes speaks of, is meant to exist throughout all time. No law intends for its own death. Law as such seeks self-preservation. This sort of arguments we made back in Fed 15. I read the closing here of 16 as at least saying, look, don't throw this thing out, this proposed constitution, because it can't cover every possibility. Mm-hmm. The expectation that everything lasts forever is, I'm going to use this word, visionary. That's the word Publius would teach us. So it's as if he's ready to walk away from this conversation at this point and say, I've done as much as I can. I've given you a whole heck of a lot, but don't expect every single thing. There are mortal feuds that can come from anything. It can be from the contagion of a violent popular paroxysm. He says, look, it might still happen. You can't figure them out. It's a limit then we must see of Publius's political science. He claims that the causes of this mortal failure of the body politic do not fall within any ordinary rules of calculation. So it's a limit of his political science. Maybe it's a limit also of what can be done in a government that seeks to have citizens who govern themselves as opposed to subjects. You know, you want security, you want duration, get under my thumb. One of the biggest problems we'll have are princes from outside of our sovereignty and whether or not the next prince within our sovereignty is a dum-dum. But we shouldn't have popular uprisings or warfare inside of our sovereign if we're ruled by absolute fear. We must see that the challenge is all the more the case in a place where people are free to have discontent from the government that can possibly give them cause for discontent. And here in this final paragraph, Publius admits there might be bad laws. Look, he says, proceeding either from weighty causes of discontent given by the government. So there's your bad laws. We could burn this place down because of something like Kansas-Nebraska Act. It's a lovely paper. Fantastic. Yep. I think it really helps us think more seriously about the role of the passions in government and appreciate all the more in constructing a government that relies on people's self-government when they have these characteristics about them.
And can I say, in closing, we still haven't talked about the Lycian and Achaean confederacies. He hinted us in paragraph number 1 that we were finally going to get to it. He said in 15 we were going to get to it, and they're mentioned once and thrown away, put on the back burner. That's not what he wants to talk about. He doesn't want to talk about historical analogs. Experience. We can learn from experience in other ways.
I'm glad I share this with Publius. I don't want to talk about him either. So I'm fine. It's okay. I don't need to, but we'll get to him soon enough. We're going to get really into the weeds starting in 18.
Yeah.
But let's look real quickly now at Fed 17 and see if we can put a button on this, Aaron. This is, again, a wonderfully titled paper. The subject continued and illustrated by examples to show the tendency of federal governments rather to anarchy among the members than tyranny in the head. We have yet another objection here. What becomes of the state governments if you have a federal government that governs individuals? Won't this itself destroy liberty? Publius is meeting an anti-federalist concern head on. What happens if you were to put ambitious human beings at the heads of the various states? Publius opens Fed 17 saying that what goes on at the state level holds little or slender allurement to ambition. Ambitious human beings are not going to seek office in state government because that's small potatoes. Publius supposes something of the power of ambition. He admits fully that human beings can be ambitious, but he's also here asserting where it is that ambition will seek to be met. Commerce, finance, negotiation, war. This helps us see that those who occupy the federal government aren't to be simple civil servants. They aren't just bureaucrats. They should be ambitious people who want big things on a big stage. The people in what will soon become Washington, D.C., tyrannize over us down in South Carolina. Isn't that what they really want to do? Publius's answer is no. They're going to want to deal with huge matters of state.
And this seems to be, even among people who are going to join the rank of bureaucrats in Washington or go into the next administration, right? That seems to be the feeling of people who would rather work in Washington than work in their home states. Right? The states are boring. That's what people say, right? Hey, look, the administration of private justice between the citizens of the same state, the supervision of agriculture and of other concerns of a similar nature, all those things, in short, which are proper to be provided for by local legislation, can never be desirable cares of a general jurisdiction. But, Mike, I don't know if you want to have this conversation right now. I'm thinking the federal government currently exercises lots of supervision over, let's say, agriculture or over commerce. Now, we may have a temptation to say, okay, Publius, you're wrong, and throw out this paper or throw out the Federalist Papers. But I don't think we would be careful readers if we did that. And I think number 17 really has to show us how to read the work entirely. Because this seems to be one of the ones where if we say, okay, one of the reasons you and I are reading the Federalist, and one of the reasons people should read the Federalist, is because it will help us understand our government better. But if we can match up the reality of government now, the federal government does administrate over these more, we would think, mundane issues that don't have to do with commerce, finance, negotiation, and war, and regulates agriculture because it calls it commerce, then maybe we don't actually understand how our federal government really works from reading the Federalist. But Publius shows us, I think, how it may come to pass that the national government might extend itself over these more local areas. Should we try to take it on like that?
I'm not sure. So I think this is a smart way of thinking about it. So what we understand to be commerce changes. And so because commerce changes, you all of a sudden realize that you're regulating whether or not a man can grow wheat on his farm, whether or not all chickens have to be priced the same, and so on and so forth. I'm thinking, of course, of Schechter Poultry with the last one, Wicker v. Filburn with the first one. What about this? Maybe Publius is wrong about a psychology of ambition. Maybe there are people who have bureaucratic souls and meddler souls, and their ambition is simply to needle and dominate in a small bureaucratic way. We could add to this as well, maybe the sort of tyranny that the world had known and seen was sort of grand ambition, as opposed to bureaucratic tyranny. I could be incorrect about this, but we have to wonder about the psychology of those occupants of the modern administrative state. And at least what we could say is, if I work at the EPA and I'm regulating what you can do on your land because it shifts and becomes a body of water that houses some protected species, and I'm now changing the way that you live on your land, I'm not understanding myself as micromanaging you on the state level. I might be understanding myself as managing you on the global level, because of the way that the modern administrative state understands all of this stuff is not on the state level. Commerce is a federal matter. Thank goodness for the Commerce Clause, they might say. And the way that air functions and the way that the Clean Air Act might be interpreted by some is that it gives a broad mandate to the powers of government to regulate carbon emissions, for crying out loud, and the health of a particular species of animal. Publius would retort, what are you talking about? Where did the federal government get this involved in the daily lives of human beings and in such grand projects as saving the earth, protecting children from unfair labor laws, and so on and so forth? And that's what's also the double-edged sword of this that we have to think very seriously about. So on one hand, you can say, well, look at the way that child labor laws came into being and how it is that the federal government relied on the Constitution to do that. And also, how is it that the federal government is enforcing CAFE standards on us? I'm trying not to actually get too much into stating what I think about these things, but I'm just saying what the federal government is doing now by way of operating on individuals, perhaps is underrated by Publius at this point. Perhaps there's a little bit of revenge of the desire to dominate other people. The libido dominandi from Hobbes coming back, and you realize, wait a minute, now that the federal government has the ability to touch the individuals, it can actually dominate them. And then we'll have this whole onslaught of bureaucrats come in and do so. There's a sea change in the ends of government with the rise of the administrative state and a violation of fundamental tenets of the United States Constitution.
He says that the state governments will maintain their influence against the federal government if the states administer their affairs with uprightness and prudence. Second, he says that the people of each state would be apt to feel a stronger bias towards their local governments than towards the government of the Union, unless the force of that principle should be destroyed by a much better administration of the latter. There are lots of things that can cause a better administration of the national government. We might think of brain drain toward the capital. We might think of technology as making it possible for this kind of exertion to happen over a large distance. We might think of historical events that would bind people toward the national government at the extent of their state governments. There might be a case for how this happens within paper number 17. I don't know.
It's a huge loophole. I heard Kessler speak of it as follows. This is a loophole so big you could drive a Mack truck through it. Yeah, if they do a better job, that's where your passion's going to lie. Even though we have this understanding of love of one's own is based in proximity, it still seems people love most people who can do the best job, not merely the people who are nearest. This strong propensity of the human heart would find powerful auxiliaries in the objects of state regulation, he assures us in the following paragraph. But there's that big loophole. So, do your job, states.
Yeah.
Do your job and do it well, because we're out here.
Do your job, do it well. I'm thinking of that comment in paragraph number 10 of paper number 16 about how the separation of powers is going to help the states resist the national government and vice versa. And we can't forget this is part of a larger constitutional scheme where the structure is meant to resist encroachment.
And people have a right, Aaron, people have a right to give their affection to whatever level of government they want. And here we can surely hope that they would give their love, their affection, their hopes and fears to whatever level of government makes the best laws. I use this word very, very carefully, rules best. No doubt Publius wants to channel those local affections to the federal government. It's going to be essential for the good functioning and safeguarding of the proposed Constitution. But what you said earlier is what is really important. You called it a brain drain. Any decent soul should leave the state government. Human interest should lie in the grandest political things. So as much as this says to the state government, you better do your job well, it also shows the federal government that it better remain occupied with the grandest things. Because if it becomes occupied with the small things, the daily affairs of human beings with which the state governments ought to be concerned, now there's a deadly competition between those two. We have two suitors for the individual's love in a much nastier way than Publius would have it from this schema of federalism he proposes. Federalist 17 ends with this discussion of European feudalism. I think the most important thing for me is that Brutus I really needs to get a lot of attention after reading Federalist Papers 17. I mean, sooner or later, we're going to have to give Brutus I his fair shake, because the distance of the national government should keep people from having a strong sense of obligation to it, as argued in Federalist 17, paragraph 8. So don't worry about the states getting usurped. But Brutus I offers us a different argument, namely that in order to enforce their laws and demand people's obedience, the federal government's still going to have to send in its troops anyway. So we're going to have to pay attention to that soon enough. But nonetheless, do you see anything interesting about feudal anarchy and European feudalism that you want to pay attention to?
There is an argument for the importance of the rule of law. Here I'll read. The ordinary administration of criminal and civil justice, it is this, which being the immediate and visible guardian of life and property, having its benefits and its terrors and constant activity before the public eye, regulating all those personal interests and familiar concerns to which the sensibility of individuals is more immediately awake, contributes more than any other circumstance to impress upon the minds of the people affection, esteem, and reverence towards the government. This great cement of society, which will diffuse itself almost wholly through the channels of the particular governments, independent of all other causes of influence, would ensure them so decided an empire over their respective citizens as to render them at all times a complete counterpoise and not unfrequently dangerous rivals to the power of the Union. Really interesting there, how the administration of the laws works between people, works on people, attracts their affections, esteem, and here a key word in thinking about how the people may become the guardian of the Constitution, of reverence as well, and how, if we're anticipating, let's say, Lincoln's Lyceum address, how important obedience to and reverence for the laws is.
At 49 as well.
Yeah.
So this is another way of assuring the states that the federal government should not usurp their authority locally. And although we have that huge loophole back there in paragraph 4, Publius doesn't want us to pay too much attention to that. Do your job well. Administer criminal and civil justice well inside the states. The people's affections will be with you. And all that's going to happen is the truly ambitious in your state are going to flee to the nation's capital to concern themselves with commerce, finance, negotiation, and war, says Publius. So this is likely to inspire a habitual sense of obligation. It should be okay. Don't worry about it. Federalism will work, Publius says, and it's going to be more stable and more secure than what we have with this mere league of friendship. Well, would you like to wrap up there?
Sure, yeah. Look, maybe we end with paragraph 13. This discussion of feudalism teaches us something that may be contrary to our understanding of European politics in the Dark Ages. Feudalism is actually, he thinks, a separation of power system, or rather a federal system, where the barons, the local authorities, are exerting superior force against the king. And he compares these to the states. The barons, like the states, will generally possess the confidence and goodwill of the people, and with so important a support, be able effectually to oppose all encroachments of the national government. But he's told us we shouldn't worry about that. Largely what we're worried about is states encroaching on the power of the national government. I think our conversation today about 17 and about the loophole and the ways in which that Publius envisions that the national government might overreach the states and the ways in which maybe he didn't envision that should give us pause there.
So I'm getting closer to being convinced that Publius is right here. Like I said, though, we've got to give Brutus maybe some guy named Sentinel a fair shake here sooner or later, Aaron.
Well, maybe after we hang out in the confederacies of antiquity.
Well, Aaron, it's been great seeing you. I really appreciate you taking the time to discuss Federalist Papers 16 and 17 with me.
Yeah, thank you.
This has been the Good Government Podcast with Aaron Slutkin and Michael Hoffpauir.